Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger here. I've got kind of an interesting show today because I at least want to start out the first segment and probably the next, possibly the whole show, talking about EVs. I know it is the year 2022. I am not an advocate. I'm not sitting here as an advocate for EVs. I'm not sitting here trying to sell you an EV. But what I wanted to go over in this episode here is to dispel some of the myths, because I have owned an EV since October of 2020. Right before my son was born, I bought a 2017 Chevy Bolt. And this is before the used car market just went crazy. The Bolt I have right now was worth $5,000 more than I paid for it. It's ridiculous. No, I don't want to sell it. It's a wonderful car, but I wanted to talk about my personal experience with driving an EV, because I think that's where a lot of people, you know, depending on what kind of media you listen to, where you get your information from or don't get information from, there's a lot of myth out there. And again, before I dive into this conversation about EV, I am not telling you to go out and buy an EV. There are very specific use cases and scenarios where an EV absolutely makes no sense. And I'm also not telling anybody to go out and buy an EV and ditch ICE vehicles forever, internal combustion engines. I still have a driveway full of internal combustion engines. My DeLorean is an internal combustion engine. I still have my 2010 Audi S5. That's a V8 internal combustion engine with a 6-speed manual transmission and 3 pedals on the floor as God intended. So I'm not coming at this from a I hate gasoline and down with fossil fuels type of perspective. I am coming at this from a very level-headed, I own both, and I have lived with an EV for the past year or two, going on 2 years, in conjunction with also owning traditional internal combustion vehicles. My wife still has her 2015 Jetta. That's a 4-cylinder. I have ICE vehicles. And in fact, I'll get into it a little bit later on. I don't think we are yet at the point where the average American driveway should go all EV. I think the best spot to be in right now for the average American driveway in most other Western countries is an EV, yeah, for most of your daily commuting, but you're still going to need, as of 2022, you're still going to need an internal combustion engine, at least in the driveway, even if using the EV cuts into the use of the internal combustion engine by at least 90%, 95%, 98%, because that's what's going to happen. If you get an EV in your driveway, your traditional gasoline vehicle is going to collect dust most of the year. You're going to have to really stay on like oil changes because it's going to sit there. The engine's not going to move. You have to remind yourself every couple weeks or so to go out and start the engine of your internal combustion engine if you have an EV also that you're relying on daily commuting. Because here's my experience. This is where it gets into my experience owning an EV. We bought the EV almost 2 years ago, and our internal combustion engines have been mostly collecting dust. They have been used very rarely, but those very rare cases are when you are glad you still have a gasoline vehicle. So again, to recap that first thought, the average American driveway in most Western civilized countries, the best driveway has an EV for your daily commuting and 90% of your transportation needs, but also a traditional gasoline or diesel vehicle for everything else. But let's get into it. I wanted to start off this conversation by saying this. This is not a political statement. Don't make a big political nothing burger out of this. But currently I am paying $5.04 to drive about 240 miles. I'll repeat that. It costs me about $5 to go over 200 miles right now because I currently pay 8.4 cents per kilowatt with JEXA. That's my plan right now. I have a 1,000 to 2,000 kilowatt plan right now with JEXA. So if I stay between those two numbers, my price per kilowatt stays around 8.4 cents. The battery in my car, try to stay with me with some of the math here. I try to keep it as simple as possible, but I'll try to be as clear as possible, but hang with me for the math here. So my car's tank, so to speak, my EV's battery pack contains 60 kilowatts. So doing the math, 60 kilowatts times 8.4 cents per kilowatt equals So $5.04, and that covers about 240 miles of range. Again, I'm not saying that to make some big political statement. That's just what I am enjoying currently. $5 to go over 200 miles. So one of the myths about EV is a lot of people don't understand the concept of charging and the draw on the grid, and that is going to make the grid implode. First of all, to that point, I'm going to say right now there are millions of EVs on the road already on the global grid, and the grid hasn't gone down. Our Texas grid has gone down because we've bidded out parts to the cheapest part vendor, and the fossil fuel portion of the grid went down in the last freeze, and it wasn't the windmill's fault. I'm just being practical. I'm just saying the truth here. I'm not saying wind energy is the answer to everything. I'm not saying solar energy is the answer to anything. But in the freeze of 2021, the grid went down. Millions of homes went without power. You got to remember that 80% of the Texas grid, at least 80% of the Texas grid right now, is still natural gas, coal, fossil fuels. So if the grid went down, that means most of the fossil fuel portion of the grid went down. A few wind turbines did freeze. That got all the publicity. Oh, here's why wind sucks. But really, what several million households without power could directly be attributed to was that the gas wasn't getting through the lines. We didn't buy enough gas. The gas that we had did not get through the lines to fuel the generators. It was mostly the fossil fuel portion of the grid that went down, because that's mostly what our grid is. So anyways, back to 120 volt charging. There's this myth about charging that people don't know how to plug in their car, where to plug in their car. They think that if they buy an EV, they need to hire an electrician to come out there for a few $1,000s and install some sort of EV specific 250 volt 60 amp circuit or whatever in their house. That's not the case. And I see this segment is rolling to an end here. I'm going to pick this up in the next segment. I can already tell right now that this whole episode is going to be devoted to dispelling EV myths and just making it real. Again, as the segment closes out here, I'm not attacking anyone. I'm not making a political statement. I'm not saying to throw your internal combustion engine into the river or get rid of your gasoline or diesel truck. I'm not saying that at all. I'm going to tell you my experience having an EV for almost 2 years. My real experience. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, here, and I am talking about my personal experience owning an EV for the past 2 years, and this is coming from a car guy. I have a 1983 DeLorean DMC-12. I have a 2010 Audi S5 V8, 6-speed manual transmissions with 3 pedals on the floor like God intended. My wife has a 2015 Volkswagen Jetta, and the EV that I have is a 2017 Chevy Bolt. So this is just my experience having, 3 or 4 normal gasoline cars and an EV. My experience owning an EV for almost 2 years. I am not an advocate for EVs. I don't mean to stomp on this dead horse if you're just listening to the podcast, but for people just tuning into the second segment of Geek Therapy Radio, I'm not telling you to go out and buy EVs. Joe Biden does not have a rhetorical gun to my head making me sell y'all EVs, because there are use cases that we'll get into where it does not make sense for you. Now, that being said, in my experience, there are very few fringe cases where EVs just don't make sense at all. For instance, if you drive 1,000 miles a day in a big rig, there's no reason, obviously, for you to need an EV or make it a viable option. We left the last, I'll get more of that later. At the end of the first segment, we were talking about charging and this myth that charging an EV is this mythical thing that even if you did buy an EV, you have to hire an electrician to come out and install a special EV port, 250 volt, 60 amp circuit in your house to charge an EV, blah, blah, blah. It's going to take down the grid. It's going to overstress the grid, all this stuff. Now, let's talk about charging for a minute. 120 volt charging at the default 8 amps equals about 960 watts. So at that rate, the charger that's included with my 2017 Chevy Bolt and all Chevy Bolts and most EVs are designed to plug into just a standard 120 volt, 15 amp or 20 amp circuit, whatever you have in your American house. That's what it comes with. It is literally no different than plugging in your smartphone to charge. It's the same exact outlet. Now, this is what's known as level 1 charging in EV speak. Level 1 is 120 volts at however many amps you can get out of your plug. So in the Chevy Bolt's case, it's 120 volts, and I can select between, do I want 8 amps or 12 amps to pull from the circuit? Do I want 960 watts or over, 1400 something watts to pull from the circuit? It defaults to 120 volts, 8 amps, to account for older buildings with wiring that might not be the best or up to spec anymore or whatever. So 8 amps at 120 volts is a lot easier for old buildings to account for. You can go into your little menu on my car at least, and I would imagine most other EVs, and select, do you want 8 amps by default, or do you want to bump it up to 12 amps, or do you want to bump it up even higher? My choices are 8 amps or 12 amps. At 120 volts, assuming that my car was dead, let's assume I pulled into my driveway in limp mode with a 100% dead battery. So my battery's at 0%, 0 miles, full depletion. It would take, at 120 volts, 8 amps, which is 960 watts, it would take 62.5 hours to recharge. That is days to recharge from dead. Now, I can already hear a lot of you screaming through your speakers, "See, that's why EVs are stupid. They take so long to charge." I get it. That is true. But let's talk about that for a little bit, because you will almost never, ever roll up to your house completely dead. You will never do. There is such a rare chance that you will actually limp into your driveway. The real use case is that you're going to leave your house fully charged and come back with 40 miles gone on your charge again, and that's going to recharge overnight, just like your cell phone. But let's dig into this a little bit. So 120 volts at 8 amps even, which is trickle charging by EV terms, that's like running your microwave. 960 watts is like running your microwave. 120 volts, 8 amps is good for the majority of charging. Most people leave it charging from when they go home, from when they get home, to when they go to work again. So let's just be flexible here and say that they get home at 6 p.m., plug in their car at 6 p.m., and then they leave again in the morning at 6 a.m. So let's just call it 12 hours at just under 1,000 watts. 12 hours of charging at the lowest rated charge speed will get you 46 miles. Most job commutes in the United States, at least, are within 20 miles. I know you're listening to this right now and you're saying mine is more than 20 miles. We'll get into that, believe me. But most commuters are 20 miles each way round trip. So even at 120 volts trickle charge, most people will still put more miles in than they will take out per day. So if you are getting 46 miles per night while it's charging, and you're only using 20 miles per day for the average commute, that's a 26 mile surplus every day. So 120 volt charging at 8 amps, 960 watts, that's going to cover most people for most needs. Doing the math a little bit more, at 12 amps, 120 volts, 12 amps, 12 hours will put 69 miles back in every night. So if you go into the computers or the little menu screen on your EV and you select 12 amps instead of 8 amps, you're going to put almost 70 miles back in the battery over 12 hours while you're sleeping, drinking beer, watching sports, whatever you're doing. You're going to get almost 70 miles just overnight. So from my experience, 120 volt trickle charging, even at 8 amps, covers at least 95% of the average driver's needs, if not more so. And please keep remembering that term, average driver's needs. Most people are average, so even at 120 volts at just 8 amps, 95%, 90 to 95% at least, if not more, of the average driver's needs will be met just with that standard 120 volt outlet in your garage that you might plug in a vacuum into, or you might plug in an electric leaf blower or something like that. My garage alone is an older house built in the 80s, probably has at least 10 120 volt outlets in the garage. Bog standard. That outlet's going to cover 95% of drivers' needs, 365 days a year. Where it gets interesting now is what about 240 volts or 220 or 250, whatever your house is rated at. At 240 volts and 12 amps, which my included charger, the charger that comes with the Chevy Bolt, if you plug it into a 240 volt outlet, it automatically switches to 240 volt circuitry and charges at 12 amps. So 240 volts at 12 amps is, well, I didn't write it down here. It's, oh gosh, I want to say it's 2,500 kilowatts, something like that. Maybe I'll see it here in a minute. Getting back on point here, 240 volts at 12 amps. If you charge for 12 hours that way, you're getting 138 miles. So again, 240 volts at 12 amps. This is just using the included charger that comes with my Chevy Bolt at least. 12 hours of charging overnight gets 138 miles. That's pretty good, actually. But here's the thing. Here's something to consider with this. Lots of garages already have a 240 or 220 or 250 volt outlet in their garage. It's usually, let's just call it 240 volts at 15 amps. That's the plug that you plug in your more power-hungry power tools into, like your table saws and your bench grinders and things like that. So they're already 240 volt outlets in a lot of garages. So charging at 240 volts, 12 amps, that gets you 138 miles, and I would wager that most houses already have that in there. So most houses can provide 138 miles overnight while they charge their car. Pretty good. So the next step up from that outlet, and again, in this portion, I'm just talking about what most houses already have in there. No calling an electrician to install extra circuits. This is just what the odds are that you listening right now, whoever you are, have these outlets already in your house. The next outlet with higher rating is easily going to be your dryer outlet. That's 240 volts, 250, 220, whatever. It's usually like a 30 amp circuit. So you already have that available in your house. I bought off of Amazon for a couple $100, 240 volt, 24 amp charger. That allows me to put 5,760 watts or 5.76 kilowatts per hour into my car, which means that I can charge my car from dead to full in around 10 hours, so less than overnight. Let's talk more about this stuff, more EVs, we could just kind of dispelling the myths. And in my experience owning an EV over the past 2 years, I still have gasoline cars, still love my DeLorean, still love my Audi S5, but let's talk about my ownership of an EV. What has it been like for me? Let's stomp some myths. I'm not trying to sell you an EV, but anyways, more Geek Therapy Radio, don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and I've been going over the realities that I have personally experienced owning an EV for almost 2 years. Now, if you're just tuning in, I still have 3 or 4 internal combustion engine cars. I have a 1983 DeLorean V6, a 5-speed manual transmission. I have a 2010 Audi S5 V8, naturally aspirated, 6-speed manual transition. It's actually for sale. So you can email me, johnny@geektherapyradio.com, if you want to inquire about the Audi. You can also go to the website, geektherapyradio.com. Get at all my socials, Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. So my 2010 Audi S5 V8, naturally aspirated, 6-speed manual transmission with 3 pedals like God intended, is for sale. My wife still has her 2015 Jetta also. It is not really for sale, but whatever. If you're interested, get at me. I'm not trying to sell you my cars. And that's actually one of the points of this show, is that even if you have an EV, I don't think we're at the stage yet where you can completely get rid of gasoline vehicles. That's a whole big, I think a lot of people think that, like, when you buy an EV, you're making this statement that you're going full EV forever. Like you shake your fist at fossil fuel and $6 a gallon gas, and you're just like, I'm going EV forever. And that's a myth, because it doesn't work for some people. Anyways, let's get back to talking voltages and everything. At the end of the last segment, I was talking about the outlets you already have in your house. So most outlets have a 120 volt outlet, which is going to cover 95% of all your EV charging needs. Just like you charge your cell phone off a 120 volt outlet, you charge your EV the exact same way. You get home, plug it in, go chug beer, watch the Astros, your car is refilling. It's wonderful. Same thing with your phone. Come home, plug in your phone, it's charging up while you're drinking beer. Great. So you have a 120 volt outlet that covers 95% of your needs at least, or my needs at least. You also have 240 volt outlets. A lot of houses have 240 volt or 220 or 250 at like 20 amps. These are things that kind of power your bench saws, table saws, bench grinders, thing like that. So most houses already have these in the garage. If you plug into that outlet, you're going to charge all the faster. 120 volts, we established you can get up to about 70 miles over 12 hours on a standard 120, which is all you need for daily use when the average driver does not drive anywhere near 70 miles a day, the average driver. The next bump up from that is that 240 volt bench grinder outlet that most people already have in their garage or runs their garage air conditioner unit, something like that. You can get 138 miles out of that easily with your standard charger that comes with the car. So the next plug outlet, the next outlet that is in most houses is your dryer outlet, and that can easily handle, in my case, I have a charger that can charge at 240 volts at 24 amps. So I'm charging about almost 5.8 kilowatts per hour, and that will charge up my car from dead to full in just over 10 hours. And those are just, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Those are just the outlets most homes already have installed. 120 volt, just normal outlet, 240 volt for power tools, and then a big giant 240 volt or 250 for your dryer, which pulls over 5,000 watts. That's just what you already have in most houses, and that by a long shot covers 99% of all EV charging needs you'd ever need day to day. So those are just the power outlets that come in most American homes. Now, if you want to step up, you can call an electrician and easily install another 250 volt, 30 amp plug to your house, socket to your house, and charge at 7.5 kilowatts. That would fill my car, which is a 60 kilowatt hour battery, that would fill my car dead to empty in about 8 hours. So even less than overnight. That's not too shabby. So that's the home charging covered. Let's move on a little bit from there. While I almost exclusively charge with a bog standard 120 volt outlet in my garage, I do use my dryer connection, that 250 24 amp charger that I have, for the other handful of times that I just want to charge faster, like after a long day trip or I drove more in a day than I anticipated. But even then, it's usually for peace of mind to know I'll have a full tank in the morning. Most of the times that I plug into my dryer outlet, like the hand, I could count on one hand all the times over the past 2 years I've had to plug into my dryer outlet. It was for peace of mind. It was just to charge a little bit faster so that I had a little bit more peace of mind the next day. But 99% of all the other times I've ever plugged in has been just a standard 120 volt outlet that uses less electricity than a hair dryer. I was almost going to say your wife's hair dryer, but I'm being woke right now. If I had long hair, I'd use a hair dryer too. Anyways, so to recap, plugging in an EV to a standard 120 volt outlet will handle 98% at least of the vast majority of drivers' needs. To cover the last 2% of scenarios, you can plug into your dryer outlet, and that's basically what I've done. 98% of what I've done has been 120 volt outlet. The other 2%, if even that, have been plugging into my big beefy dryer outlet. So the easiest way to think about an EV is to treat it, like I mentioned, exactly like your phone. Just plug it in every day and you'll always start with a full charge, just like your cell phone. It is no more complicated than that. Just set it and forget it. Plug it in while you get home, and it will be adding miles while you're playing video games, chugging beer, watching football, watching the Astros, and while you're sleeping. When you go out to your car again in the morning, it will be full. You will have a full tank, quote unquote, every morning. So my V8, my 2010 Audi S5 V8 just sits there in the driveway anyway, not doing anything. Charging an EV is like an automatic gas service that fills up my V8 while it's just sitting there while I'm drinking beer and relaxing. It's very nice. So just treat your EV like charging your phone, and it will more than keep up with 98% at least of your commuting needs for the average commuter. So let's talk about that other 2% of times when you unexpectedly need to drive a lot more in a day than you plan for. So let's talk about fast charging, specifically what's called level 3 fast charging. To recap again, 120 volts, that's level 1. 220 volts plus, like 220, 240, 250, whatever, that's level 2 charging. Level 3 charging are those big honking Tesla chargers and things you see in parking lots and at hotels and things like that. So my car charges at level 3 at a maximum of around 50 kilowatts per hour. Remember, my battery pack is a 60 kilowatt battery pack. So my car charges at a maximum of around, or just a little bit over actually, 50 kilowatts. I'll spare the technicals on the physics of fast charging, where the current ramps up and then down while charging, meaning when you plug in, it's not going 50 kilowatts the whole time. When you first plug in, it's probably going to start 30 kilowatts or so, ramp up to just over 50, and then the last bit of the charging is going to ramp back down. That's just the way battery technology works. It's the same with your smartphone. It's the same with anything you plug in and charge up. Anything battery charging, lead acid batteries the same way. There's the bulk charging, and then there's charging that tapers off and steps down as you reach full charge, so you don't boil the electrolyte out of your lead acid battery. So the physics of charging is the same with an EV, with lithium-ion battery packs. So yes, you can charge it up to 50 kilowatts, but it's not charging at 50 kilowatts the whole time. It starts low, ramps up, and then ramps back down. So all you need to know is that if I pulled into a fast charger with 0% battery, it would take me around an hour and 45 minutes to get 100% charge. Put a pin in that. Think about that. Almost 2 hours for me to go from 0 to 100%. Let's talk about that for a second. That's just my model of car. New EVs will go from dead to full in less than a road trip pit stop. So like the new Hyundai Ioniq 5 and 6, they can charge it up to 350 kilowatts per hour, which is nuts. And they have around 70 kilowatt battery pack. They'll charge from dead to full in under an hour. It's like if you pull over on a road trip for lunch, your car completely dead, your car will be fully charged by the time before you even pay your tab. So anyways, let's move on. I can hear knee-jerk reaction scoffing through my headphones, which I'm not actually wearing right now, but that's what I wrote. I can hear, but I can still hear you scoffing. Your 2017 Bolt takes almost 2 hours to charge, and even new EVs can take 30 minutes or so? This is compared to like charging with gas, which takes a few minutes to fill your tank up. 10 gallons, 20 gallons, or if you drive a big dually, way more than that. Anyways, here's the thing. Here's what I can tell you from actual ownership. Yes, they can take that long. And yes, they do take that long to go from dead to full. So at best, dead to full in about 30 minutes with new EVs. For me, dead to full would take almost 2 hours. But here's the actual reality that you learn when you own an EV for an extended period of time. You're almost never ever dead. When you pull up to a level 3 charger, you are almost never ever completely dead. You almost always have a charge left. You almost never pull up needing a full charge. Here's what actually happens. The reality is you almost always pull up to a fast charger with some juice. And all you ever really need is just enough juice to get home. So 99 times out of 100, you don't need 250 miles of charge. You only need maybe 10 or 20 miles. That real world scenario means you only need to pump electrons as fast as pumping gas. Meaning if you stand at a gas pump for 5 minutes to fill your tank, if you stand at an EV charger for 5 minutes to fill your tank, that 5 minutes is going to get you home for the rest of the charging. Let's put a pin in that. Let's come back to this conversation in the last segment of Geek Therapy Radio. You are listening to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator. Let's keep talking EVs. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. We are talking about EVs. I'm not trying to sell you an EV. I'm not trying to kick fossil fuel cars to the road. I'm still a car guy. I've got a V8. I've got a V6. I've got a 4-cylinder just in my driveway, but I also have an EV, and I've owned it for almost 2 years. So I'm talking about the realities that I've discovered over 2 years of ownership of an EV, because we hear so much myth and rhetoric about EVs. There is so much misinformation and just lunacy out there about what EVs are and aren't, what they can and can't do, how they can fit into your life, and why they will or won't work for most people. There's so much I guarantee you that at least one thing you know about an EV is wrong. The average person listening right now, I can guarantee you almost at least one thing that you think you know for certain about EVs is complete hogwash. For one thing, a lot of people think EVs are slow. Teslas will do 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. My bog standard 2017 Chevy Bolt will do 0 to 60 as fast as a Volkswagen GTI. It'll do 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds. And that's just what I haul my son around in. EVs are fast. They are extremely fast. Sub 2 second 0 to 60 fast. That's how fast. So this idea that EVs are slow, that comes from this notion about like the old, like early adopters, 2012-ish era kind of Nissan Leafs and things that only had a range of about 80 or 90 miles and went 0 to 60 in God knows how long, 12 seconds, 13 seconds. Now, there's not a new EV being sold right now that has anything slower than a 7-second 0 to 60 time. My little crossover EV does 0 to 60 in around 6 seconds. Teslas will do 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. They will send you to the hospital. They're so fast. The G-forces, if you were to repeatedly expose yourself to those G-forces that you experience in an EV, you will go to the hospital. You'll have heart palpitations. You'll be bruised. Your bones, you'll get pinched nerves. It's dangerous how fast EVs are. The new Hummer EV that's coming out will do 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds. That is just shot in the dark here. Almost a 9,000-pound vehicle, maybe 7. I don't know the official weight. It's a Hummer. It's huge, and it's got a huge battery in it, and it will do 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. EVs are the fastest cars on the road. So this myth that they're slow is it's just completely untrue. So let's go back to my experience charging. So at best, the best new EVs can charge, if you're at a perfect charger and you're in the right car, they can charge 0 to full in 30 minutes. They can, and yes, it will take that long to fully charge an EV. My EV personally can't charge it that fast. I can only charge at 50 kilowatts, and it would take me almost 2 hours to go from 0 to full. But you almost never pull up to a level 3 charger completely dead. You almost always have juice. The reality is that you pull into the charger with some juice, and all you really need is just enough juice to get home. So 99 times out of 100, you don't need 250 miles of charge. You only need 10 or 20, just that last little bit to go home. And then you can plug it into your home charger for pennies on the dollar and charge while you're chugging beer watching the Astros. So to recap, you don't ever need to sit there for 30 minutes on an EV. Rarely do you ever need to sit there for 30 minutes at a charger. Extremely rarely, if almost never, do you ever need to sit there for 2 hours waiting for it to charge. You just need a few minutes. The same amount of time it takes you to pump gas, you can pump electrons into your car to get home in 99.9% of scenarios. So it's a myth that you need to sit at a charger for 2 hours or whatever to fill your tank. You almost never, ever, ever, ever have to do that. So then when you're home and you're relaxing in your boxers and drinking beer and watching Astros, like I say, your car's in the garage filling up the rest of the way, as I mentioned, for pennies on the dollar. You're filling up for around $5, even when a Prius currently takes $50 or more. Even that dorky little Prius that you see next to your big jacked up dually, that still costs at least $50 to fill the tank of that car. Whereas in my use case scenario with my 2017 Bolt, as I mentioned earlier, it cost me $5 to go over 200 miles. $5 to fill my tank. And again, I'm not telling you that you should sell your dually and go buy an EV. That's not what I'm saying. We're not there yet to where we can completely ditch our gas engines. I'm just saying that's the reality. That's what I've experienced owning my EV. In addition to my stable of gas cars, is that the EV takes $5 for me to go over 200 miles versus the gas cars, which take dozens of dollars, $100. My Audi is like 14 gallons times 5. What is the math there? It's a lot. It's a lot of money. So that's been wonderful in my case. In most EV drivers' cases, has been like just the savings at the gas pump. Again, I'm not saying that so that you go down to Tesla or whatever and buy or Ford and order a new F-150 Lightning. I'm not trying to sell you an EV. I'm just talking about the realities, just talking about the numbers of after 2 years of ownership and experiencing it and still owning gasoline cars. So Those are the benefits discussed and myths debunked, but there are some realities. While adding an EV to the driveway would make sense for 95% of the for 95% of drivers, here's why it won't make sense for fringe cases, possibly even yours. First of all, apartments. It's hard to charge an EV if you live in an apartment. Run a big old extension cord if you can, but it just doesn't. EVs in apartment buildings don't really make sense unless your building has dedicated EV charging spots. Anyways, here's some more fringe cases where it wouldn't make sense. Really, it boils down to two factors: how much you drive per day, and if you drive a lot per day. And your there's two things. It's how much you drive per day and your access to decent charging. So do some personal math. If you drive less than 46 miles per day, even an old house with crappy wiring will more than cover your needs. Just plug it in, 120 volts, 8 amps, you're set. Keep in mind that there will be days where you drive way less or not at all. So we talked about that 12-hour overnight charging. Think about other times and over holidays and things like that where your car's sitting there for maybe 36 hours, 48 hours. You're not driving it for a couple days. That's all just charge time. That's all just juice going back into your car. So again, like I said previously, this scenario covers the vast majority of drivers, most likely even you listening. For the vast majority of drivers, their car will be full every time they leave in the morning. Every time they leave in the morning, your car will be full. Most people don't realize how often their car is actually sitting unused. Weekends, holidays, like I just mentioned, even on a busy schedule, most people have huge gaps between driving. And a standard 120-volt outlet is more than good enough to keep your car fully charged, considering those big long gaps and considering overnight. But if you drive more than 200 miles per day, you will at least want access to a 240-volt outlet and or live in an area with fast chargers around. To put it more simply, if you drive further per day than 90% of people, you'll need to know where at least a 240-volt outlet is at all times. So my point is, if your life and livelihood depends on covering hundreds of miles per day, obviously the current state of EV technology isn't quite there to make it viable for your outlier use case scenario. Now, I want to move on to some tips and other thoughts regarding EVs as we wind up the segment here. First, it helps to think outside the box in terms of charging. Keep in mind that RV parks, campsites, many other facilities have high amperage 250-volt outlets. It is extremely rare that most EV drivers will need them, but it's good to keep in the back of your mind. Also, a lot of offices have EV charging. Some are even free. If your office offers free 240-volt charging, you may never put a penny in your tank, so to speak. And if you wanted to be that person, you could even talk to the building manager and trickle charge on a 120-volt outlet while you're at work. So even if you don't have an EV, just start noticing the world around you, how many plugs there are. You'll notice that they're everywhere, even beefy 240-volt, 250-volt high amperage outlets. Just imagine all of them are gas pumps. Another thing to consider is your electricity plan. You'd actually be surprised. Oh, I'm running out of time here. Do the math. I'll just say in a nutshell, adding an EV to my household has not bumped up my electricity use as much as I thought it would. What did bump up my electricity use was having a child. More loads of laundry, more hot water being used. But if you plan to buy an EV, just do some math with your electricity bill and get the right plan for you if you need to. Thank you so much for listening. I am going to go way over my bump here, but I just need to wrap it up like this. There's some more that I didn't get to, and maybe I'll cover it in another episode. But hopefully I shed some light on EVs for you, hopefully kind of dispelled some of the myths. It's just, there's a lot to it. But at any rate, know that you're loved. You're worthy of love. You're worthy of giving love. You're worthy of receiving love. And you're worthy of your own self-respect. It is possible in this world to love big throaty V8s and also understand the appeal of EVs. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.